All right, this video is going to walk through the intro to section 13.4, inverses of trigonometric functions. So I'm going to move this down a little bit. So we are just going to start by talking about sine of theta. Up here at the top, you can see I wrote SOHCAHTOA. So that's our mnemonic device to help us remember what sine, cosine, and tangent tell us about an angle. So if we have angle theta, we find sine of theta, it's going to give us the ratio of the opposite side over the hypotenuse. Opposite over hypotenuse. So you're plugging in an angle and you're getting out the ratio of the two sides. So we're talking about inverses of these trig functions today, which reverses that process. It goes in the other direction. See, it's the opposite. So we have sine inverse, and we write that as sine, and you have this exponent. Basically, it's not necessarily an actual exponent, but it looks like one. It's to indicate the inverse. So read that as sine inverse or the inverse of sine. So what that does is it takes a number, a decimal, which is really the ratio of the opposite side over the hypotenuse, and then it tells you what your angle was. So again, it just reverses the order. You plug in the opposite over the hypotenuse, and it gives you out the angle, whereas our standard sine function plugs in the angle and gives you out the ratio. So we have an inverse function for sine, cosine, tangent. You could also have inverse functions for cosecant and secant and cotangent. We won't really be getting into those inverse functions. We'll just stick with our sine, cosine, and tangent. So let's move this down a little bit. So we can see our function. Let's say we have sine theta, gives us opposite over hypotenuse. Now the reciprocal, that's cosecant, and that's what we've talked about before. Cosecant of theta is the hypotenuse over the opposite side. So it switches around your ratio. It changes the fraction. It flips it over. But the inverse, what it does is it changes your input and your output. It switches these two around to make your ratio the input and your angle the output. So notice the reciprocal is different than the inverse, and the inverse is what we're focusing on in this section. So we've got sine, and then we have cosine of theta. We know that gives us the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. The reciprocal of cosine is secant. If you plug in theta to secant, it's going to give you the hypotenuse over the adjacent side. And then the inverse would be cosine inverse. And you would plug in your adjacent side over your hypotenuse, and it's going to tell you the angle theta. And then the third one we have is tangent, which we know gives us the ratio of the opposite side to the adjacent. That's our TOA in SOHCAHTOA. And then the reciprocal is cotangent, which flips over the fraction, gives us adjacent over opposite. And then the inverse would be tangent inverse. So we would plug in opposite over adjacent and get out our angle theta. And again, these inverse functions, that's what we're introducing here in this section. And we'll get a few examples talking about those.